Another big pitching misconception is push off. I hear push off all the time. Push off the rubber, push forward. We are not pushing off. By pushing off, we are actually physically disconnecting our body as opposed to connecting our body. Pushing off might get me more distance out, but it's not going to allow me to get into the proper rotation of my hips. I can possibly get into the right rotation of my hips, but the odds of that are extremely small. So you're talking a small selection of the population that has enough coordination to be able to push or jump off the mound, pushing off their backside, and still be able to coordinate that movement with a hip turn, not come out of that sequence, and not put more undue stress into their arm because their sequence is wrong. We are not pushing off the ground, people. We are pushing into the ground. I'm using the ground to create leverage, to create force in my backside. So as I go forward, there is energy being put into the ground. I'm holding the ground. I'm not pushing off the ground. I'm pushing into the ground. As I go forward and I'm unloading from this push into the ground, this force I'm holding into the ground, I'm going to try to maintain that force so I can continue to create leverage in my leg so that my leg can start to move my hip into my foot down. My leverage of my leg into my hip is what begins the rotation process of the hip. The hip does not fire on its own. So I need the ground to be able to leverage my leg, to be able to turn my hip, to begin the hip turn into foot down so my hip can accelerate after foot down. So again, if I'm in a pitching position and I push off the ground, you can see how my leg extends away from my body. This is disconnecting my leg from my hip. Now when I land, my hip has to do all the work, which it's not going to have enough time to do, and it's going to have to pull the dead weight of my back leg. That's what we're trying to avoid as a pitcher, is having to just use my hips without using my legs and have to use my hips to go slower because they have to pull more weight. As I get into that landing, as I'm holding force into the ground, even as I turn, my back leg is still pushing into the ground as I'm moving away from the ground forward, and my leg now is still being able to create that leverage in the turn. So when I land, my hips are essentially, let's say, 25% through my throw. Now when I land, my hips can immediately take over through the rest of my throw. But once again, if I push off the ground, I'm going to disconnect from that sequence. It's like having a hiccup in a sequence. That would be like, I always use the analogy for a quick thought process. That'd be like walking and then one time, or running, and then as you're running, one time having to come down on your heel. You're not going to stop running, but you're going to break your sequence and you're going to have to try to refire the sequence. As a pitcher, I don't have time to refire the sequence. As a runner, it's a longer distance. I could probably get away with it. Ain't going to happen as a pitcher. So make sure we are not pushing off the rubber. We are using the ground for leverage to be able to create unloading leverage from the ground as well.